The summer of 1851 in Crescent County, Louisiana brought with it an oppressive heat that seemed to press down on the living like the weight of buried secrets. The air hung thick with the scent of magnolias and something darker, something the polite society of Bellefonte refused to name. In the grand dining hall of Whitmore Manor, crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across walls papered with silk imported from France, while in the separate kitchen building just 50 yards behind, Delphine Rousseau stirred a pot with the precision of someone who understood that every ingredient carried consequences. Before we journey deeper into this dark chapter of American history, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She was known throughout 3 parishes as the finest cook in Louisiana, her culinary skills so renowned that plantation owners traveled days just to taste her creations. Her gumbo could make grown men weep. Her beignets were lighter than morning fog over the Pearl River, and her black molasses cake, served only on the most special occasions, was said to be a taste of heaven itself. But between the years of 1847 and 1851, 7 prominent men who dined at Whitmore Manor and savored that particular delicacy never made it home. They died within days, their bodies discovered in their beds or carriages, faces peaceful as if they had simply drifted into eternal sleep. Physicians attributed the deaths to heart failure, apoplexy, or the mysterious fevers that plagued the South. No one suspected that the most celebrated cook in Louisiana had turned her kitchen into an execution chamber, or that each death was as carefully planned as the elaborate menus she prepared for her master's dinner parties. This is the true story of how one woman transformed culinary artistry into calculated vengeance, how the finest dishes became instruments of justice in a world where the law offered none, and how the dinner table, that sacred space of Southern hospitality, became a final reckoning for men who thought themselves untouchable. It is a story about power concealed beneath submission, about poison disguised as sustenance, and about how the invisible hands that fed the powerful held more control than anyone imagined. The Louisiana of 1847 existed in a strange twilight between elegance and atrocity. The plantation economy had reached its terrible zenith, producing wealth beyond imagination for a select few while grinding countless souls into the blood-soaked soil. Crescent County represented the heart of this system, its fertile lands yielding cotton and sugarcane in quantities that made men rich enough to build monuments to their own vanity. The grand estates rose like white temples among the magnolia groves, their columned facades presenting a vision of classical nobility, while concealing a brutal reality that would eventually tear the nation apart. Bellefonte, the county seat, had grown prosperous on the backs of the enslaved. Its main street boasted a courthouse built of imported marble, a hotel with velvet curtains in every window, and shops selling luxuries shipped from New Orleans, New York, and even Europe. On Saturday mornings, the town square filled with the business of buying and selling human beings, an obscenity conducted with the same casual efficiency as livestock auctions. The white citizens of Bellefonte considered themselves cultured, refined people who attended church every Sunday and hosted elaborate social gatherings where they discussed literature, politics, and philosophy while enslaved servants refilled their wine glasses and cleared their plates. The summer heat in Louisiana was not merely uncomfortable but transformative. It changed the texture of the air itself, making every breath feel like inhaling warm water. It turned milk sour within hours and caused meat to spoil before midday. It drove people to desperation, to violence, to madness. The wealthy retreated to their high-ceilinged rooms with windows thrown open to catch any whisper of breeze, while those who labored in the fields and kitchens endured temperatures that could kill. This heat created a pressure that built throughout the long months, a tension that permeated every interaction and decision, making the already brutal conditions of enslavement even more unbearable. In this suffocating world of extreme inequality and normalized cruelty, certain truths were understood by everyone but spoken by no one. The enslaved population outnumbered their enslavers in many parishes, a demographic reality that haunted the dreams of white Southerners and led to increasingly harsh laws designed to prevent organization and rebellion. Every act of kindness from an enslaved person was scrutinized for signs of resistance. Every smile was examined for traces of mockery. The system required constant vigilance and overwhelming violence to maintain, and both were applied with ruthless consistency. But there were spaces where the enslaved held knowledge and power that their masters could never fully control. The kitchen was such a space. Here, the preparation of food created opportunities for autonomy that existed nowhere else in the plantation hierarchy. A skilled cook became indispensable, her knowledge of flavors and techniques elevating her status above other enslaved workers. She controlled what entered the bodies of the most powerful people in the county, a responsibility that carried implicit trust and equally implicit danger. The white families who depended on these cooks for their daily sustenance existed in a state of willful blindness, never allowing themselves to acknowledge the vulnerability inherent in eating food prepared by people they oppressed. The Catholic Church maintained a significant presence in Louisiana, its influence woven through the social fabric in ways that distinguished the region from the Protestant-dominated areas farther east. The rituals of confession and communion, the emphasis on suffering and redemption, the imagery of blood and sacrifice, all of this created a particular spiritual atmosphere. Many enslaved people in Louisiana practiced a complex faith that blended Catholicism with older traditions carried from Africa, creating belief systems that their enslavers neither understood nor approved of but could never fully suppress. In the quiet hours of night, prayers were offered to saints the church would not recognize, and justice was sought through channels that existed outside the law. This was the world into which Delphine Rousseau had been born in 1813, the daughter of a woman who died bringing her into existence and a father she would never know. She had been raised in the kitchen at Whitmore Manor, learning the alchemical art of transforming raw ingredients into dishes that could make people forget themselves. Her teacher had been an elderly woman named Celestine, who claimed to remember Africa, though whether this was literal memory or inherited knowledge passed down through generations, Delphine never knew. Celestine taught her that food was medicine, that plants held powers the white physicians never learned, and that a cook who truly understood her craft could heal or harm with equal ease. By the time Delphine reached womanhood, she had surpassed her teacher. Her talent was undeniable, almost supernatural in its consistency. She could taste a dish once and recreate it perfectly. She understood instinctively which flavors would complement and which would clash. She knew the exact moment to remove something from heat, the precise quantity of seasoning required, the perfect texture for every sauce and cream. Colonel Augustus Whitmore recognized her value immediately when he inherited the plantation from his father in 1835. He gave her unprecedented authority over the kitchen, allowed her to order supplies directly from merchants in New Orleans, and even permitted her to teach her nephew Isaiah the craft. This authority came with its own chains, of course. Delphine could never leave. Her skill made her too valuable to sell and too dangerous to free. The dinner parties at Whitmore Manor were legendary throughout Louisiana. Invitations were coveted by everyone of significance in the region. To dine at the Whitmore table meant you had arrived in society, that your wealth and influence were recognized by the county's most prominent family. Colonel Whitmore used these gatherings to conduct business that could not be managed in the formal settings of offices and banks. Deals were struck over cognac in the library. Political alliances were forged while servants carved roasted duck. The future of the county, and by extension a significant portion of Louisiana's economy, was often decided in that dining room while Delphine's creations were consumed and praised. The menu for these dinners followed a ritualized structure that never varied significantly. The evening began with oysters on ice, brought up from the Gulf that very morning, and served with Delphine's mignonette sauce that somehow balanced acid and sweetness in perfect harmony. Next came a rich turtle soup, its complex flavors requiring hours of preparation and a delicate hand with the sherry. The fish course featured whatever had been freshest at market, often pompano or red snapper, prepared simply to showcase its quality. Then came the centerpiece, usually a roasted game bird or a cut of beef so tender it could be separated with a fork, accompanied by vegetables from the manor's gardens prepared in the French style. After this, a palate cleanser of lemon ice followed by cheese and fruit, and finally on the most special occasions, Delphine's black molasses.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Cake. This cake had become her signature, the dish that guests requested specifically and remembered for years afterward. It was a dense, dark creation with layers of molasses-infused sponge alternating with a filling made from brown sugar, butter and cream. The frosting was a glossy dark chocolate that held its shape perfectly despite the heat. The taste was complex, starting with the deep bitterness of dark molasses, transforming into caramel sweetness, and finishing with notes of spice that lingered on the tongue. Guests invariably asked for the recipe, and Delphine invariably smiled and demurred, explaining that it was a family secret passed down from her grandmother, which was true enough, though not in the way they imagined. What made the cake truly special What gave it that indefinable quality that kept people thinking about it long after the meal had ended, was an ingredient Delphine never mentioned. She harvested it herself from the swampy areas near the Pearl River, a particular variety of oleander that grew in dense thickets where the water moved slowly. The plant was beautiful, with clusters of pink and white flowers that seemed innocent in their loveliness, but every part of it contained cardiac glycosides, compounds that could stop a human heart if administered in the correct dosage. The trick was in the preparation and the timing. Too much would cause immediate violent illness that even the most incompetent physician would recognize as poisoning. Too little would have no effect at all. But the exact right amount, carefully extracted and mixed into ingredients with strong enough flavors to mask any bitterness, would cause what appeared to be natural heart failure several days after consumption, long after the victim had left Whitmore Manor and returned to his own home. Delphine had not always known how to kill with her cooking. That knowledge came to her slowly, born from desperation and rage that had nowhere else to go. The first death, the one that showed her what was possible, had been almost accidental. A guest at the manor had eaten something that disagreed with him, some combination of rich food and pre-existing weakness that caused him to collapse 3 days after the dinner party. When news of his death reached the kitchen, Delphine had felt something stir in her chest, a dark flower of possibility beginning to bloom. She began to pay attention to which guests became ill after dining at the manor, which ones complained of stomach troubles or heart palpitations. She began to experiment with tiny amounts of various plants, noting the effects in a mental catalog she kept carefully hidden from everyone around her. The transformation from accidental death to deliberate murder took 3 years. During that time, Delphine educated herself in ways that would have been illegal if anyone had known. She learned to read by studying the discarded newspapers that made their way to the kitchen, puzzling out words late at night by candlelight after everyone else had gone to sleep. She acquired books on botany and medicine by having Isaiah steal them from the manor's library, one at a time, always returning them before they could be missed. She cultivated relationships with other enslaved people who worked as healers and midwives, trading recipes and remedies, slowly accumulating knowledge about which plants caused which effects in the human body. By 1847, Delphine had perfected her method. She had identified her weapon, understood its properties completely, and developed a delivery system that was undetectable. More importantly, she had identified her targets. The men who would die at Whitmore Manor were not chosen randomly. Each one had committed specific acts of cruelty that Delphine had witnessed or learned about through the invisible network of communication that existed among the enslaved. Each one represented a particular kind of evil that the law would never punish, and each one would die thinking he had simply enjoyed an excellent meal, never suspecting that the woman who smiled and curtsied in the kitchen doorway, as guests complimented her cooking, had just administered his death sentence. The dinner party was more than just a meal at Whitmore Manor. It was theater, a carefully choreographed performance where every element contributed to an atmosphere of refinement and abundance. The dining room itself was a masterpiece of antebellum excess. The table could seat 20 comfortably, its mahogany surface polished to a mirror shine that reflected the light from 3 crystal chandeliers. The chairs were upholstered in burgundy velvet, and the walls were covered in French wallpaper depicting pastoral scenes of European countryside that bore no resemblance to the Louisiana landscape visible through the tall windows. Silver candelabras marched down the center of the table, and the china was imported from England, each piece decorated with delicate hand-painted flowers. Colonel Augustus Whitmore presided over these gatherings with the bearing of a man who considered himself nobility. He was tall and broad-shouldered despite his age, his face weathered from years of supervising work in the fields but still handsome in a severe way. His hair had gone silver but remained thick, combed back from a high forehead. He wore his wealth casually, his evening clothes tailored perfectly but without ostentation, a gold watch chain the only visible sign of his fortune. When he spoke, others listened, not only because of his economic power, but because he possessed a certain magnetism, a confidence that comes from never having been truly challenged or denied. His wife Vivienne was rarely seen at these dinner parties. She had been beautiful once, or so the older servants claimed, but years of childbearing and unspecified illnesses had left her a ghost who haunted the upper floors of the manor. When she did make appearances, she moved slowly and spoke little, her pale face emerging from layers of shawls and scarves like something not quite alive. The management of the household had fallen to their daughter Cordelia, who at 24 had become the de facto mistress of Whitmore Manor. Cordelia Whitmore was beautiful in the way that Southern women of her class were expected to be, with pale skin protected fanatically from the sun, dark hair arranged in elaborate curls, and a figure maintained through corsetry so tight it sometimes made breathing difficult. But there was a hardness in her eyes that no amount of practiced gentility could disguise. She had been raised to command enslaved servants, and she did so with casual cruelty, distributing punishments for minor infractions with the same tone she might use to discuss the weather. Delphine had watched Cordelia grow from a spoiled child into a cold woman who seemed to take pleasure in the suffering of others, and the cook had catalogued every slight, every unnecessary punishment, every moment of calculated humiliation. Delphine Rousseau had been born into slavery at Whitmore Manor, in the spring of 1813, delivered by a midwife named Celestine, who would later become her teacher in the culinary arts. Her mother had died 3 days after childbirth from a fever that no remedy could break, and her father was never spoken of, though the older women in the slave quarters whispered that he had been sold away before Delphine drew her first breath. She had no memories of being held by her mother, no lullabies sung in a voice she would recognize, no stories of family lineage that stretched back beyond the moment of her own arrival into the world. Her first memory was of the kitchen, the perpetual heat radiating from the massive brick fireplace, and Celestine's gnarled hands guiding her small fingers as she learned to knead dough. The kitchen at Whitmore Manor stood separate from the main house, a practical necessity in the era before modern ventilation when cooking fires could heat a structure to unbearable temperatures. The building was constructed of brick with a slate roof, a single large room dominated by the enormous fireplace that served as the primary cooking surface. Cast iron pots of varying sizes hung from hooks, and a system of cranes and chains allowed the cook to adjust the height of each vessel above the flames. Along the walls were wooden tables for preparation, shelves holding ingredients and implements, and a smaller fireplace used specifically for baking. There was a root cellar beneath the floor, accessed through a trapdoor, where vegetables and certain preserves were kept cool. The smell of the kitchen was a permanent perfume of wood smoke, herbs, rendered fat, and the ghosts of 10,000 meals prepared in that space over decades. Celestine had been ancient even when Delphine was a child, her face a geography of wrinkles that deepened when she smiled, which was rarely. She had been brought to Louisiana as a young woman, stolen from her homeland across the ocean in circumstances she never fully described, but which had left scars on her back and soul that time could not erase. She spoke English with an accent that made certain words sound like music, and sometimes late at night she would sing songs in a language Delphine did not understand, but felt in her chest like something both mournful and defiant. Celestine knew things that the white families who owned her would have found terrifying if they had ever paused to consider the depth of knowledge that could exist in someone they considered property. From Celestine, Delphine learned not just how to cook but how to see food as something more than sustenance. Every ingredient had properties beyond nutrition. Certain herbs could calm the nerves or sharpen the mind. Some roots could ease pain while others could cause it. The old woman taught her to identify dozens of plants that grew wild in the swamps and forests around Crescent County, explaining which parts were edible, and which were poison, which could be used for medicine, and which for other purposes she described only in whispers. She taught Delphine that a cook held power that was invisible to those who ate but absolute in its own way, the ability to nourish or harm, to provide pleasure or inflict suffering, all disguised within the ordinary act of preparing a meal. As Delphine grew from child to young woman, her talent in the kitchen became undeniable. By the age of 15, she could prepare dishes that made visitors close their eyes in appreciation. By 20, her reputation had spread throughout the county, and Colonel Whitmore began to receive requests from other plantation owners, asking if they might borrow his cook for special occasions, requests he always refused because he understood the value of what he possessed. Delphine's skill became a source of pride for the Whitmore family, another marker of their superiority over their neighbors. They would speak of her in the third person even when she stood in the room, describing her abilities as if she were a particularly well-trained animal, rather than a human being who had spent thousands of hours perfecting her craft. The praise heaped upon her cooking never translated into anything resembling freedom or safety. Delphine remained property, subject to sale or punishment at the whim of her owners. She watched as friends and fellow enslaved people were sold away when the Whitmores needed cash or wanted to make room for younger workers. She witnessed beatings for infractions as minor as breaking a dish or speaking without permission. She saw women violated by white men who faced no consequences, children torn from their mothers' arms, families destroyed by the casual economics of the slave trade. And through it all she was expected to smile, to curtsy, to express gratitude for the privilege of being allowed to demonstrate her skills. The rage that built in Delphine over the years was like a fire that had been banked but never extinguished, coals glowing hot beneath a layer of ash, waiting for the right moment to burst into flame. She learned to hide it behind a mask of docility, to speak in the soft tones expected of enslaved women, to lower her eyes and present the appearance of submission. But in the privacy of her own thoughts, she nurtured that anger, fed it with every new indignity and injustice she witnessed, let it grow into something cold and patient and calculating. She understood that open rebellion would result in her death or sale, that violence would be met with overwhelming force. So she waited, learned, and prepared for a form of resistance that her oppressors would never see coming. Her sister Esther had been purchased by Colonel Whitmore in 1828, brought from a plantation in Mississippi after her previous owner died, and his estate was liquidated. Esther was older by 6 years, and the reunion with a sibling she barely remembered was both joyful and painful. Esther had lived a harder life, bearing the scars of brutal overseers, and bearing 2 children who had been sold before they could walk. The experience had hollowed something out of her, leaving her capable of functioning but empty of hope. She worked in the main house, cleaning and serving, moving through her tasks with mechanical efficiency, while some essential part of her remained unreachable. Delphine tried to protect her sister when she could, sharing food from the kitchen and advocating for her with Cordelia Whitmore when Esther's work was criticized, but there were limits to what even the valued cook could do. Isaiah came to them in 1843, Esther's son from a brief relationship with a man on a neighboring plantation. He was 14 years old, already tall and showing the promise of significant strength, which made him valuable for field work. But Delphine had convinced Colonel Whitmore to assign the boy to the kitchen instead, arguing that she needed an assistant and that Isaiah showed aptitude for the work. It was partially true, the boy was quick to learn, and had good instincts about flavors and timing. But Delphine's real motivation was to keep him close, to protect him from the brutality of the fields, and to teach him skills that might someday prove useful in ways that had nothing to do with cooking. Isaiah was bright in a way that made Delphine nervous for him. He asked questions about everything, wanted to understand not just how to do things but why they worked the way they did. He learned to read far more quickly than Delphine had, and he was careless about hiding his knowledge, occasionally correcting white people when they made factual errors, a dangerous habit that she tried repeatedly to break him of. But she also recognized something of herself in the boy's hunger for understanding, his refusal to accept that his condition was natural or permanent. She taught him everything she knew about cooking, but also about plants and their properties, about poisons and antidotes, about the invisible ways that power could be exercised by those who appeared powerless. The separate kitchen building where Delphine spent most of her waking hours had become her domain in ways that transcended its physical boundaries. She had arranged the space exactly as she wanted it, with everything positioned for maximum efficiency. She knew the temperature of different areas of the fireplace by sight, could judge the doneness of bread by sound, could tell if meat had spoiled by the slightest change in its smell. The kitchen was hot in summer and warm in winter, and the work was physically demanding in ways that left her exhausted by the end of each day. But it was also the one place where she exercised real control, where her decisions were final, and her expertise was respected even by Colonel Whitmore himself. The walls of the kitchen held secrets that no one else knew existed. Behind loose bricks near the back corner, Delphine had created a hiding place where she kept things that would have resulted in severe punishment if discovered. A stolen book on medicinal plants, a journal where she recorded her experiments with various ingredients, written in a code of her own invention that substituted cooking terms for other meanings, small vials containing tinctures and extracts that she had prepared with painstaking care, and a list of names, men who had committed acts that she had witnessed or learned about through the network of communication among enslaved people across multiple plantations. Judge Horace Blackwell was the first name on that list. He was a circuit judge who traveled throughout Louisiana, presiding over cases with the authority of law behind his decisions. He was known for his harsh sentences against enslaved people accused of crimes, often ordering punishments that seemed designed more to terrorize than to deliver justice. Delphine had learned from a woman who worked in the judge's household that he had a practice of purchasing enslaved women who appeared in his courtroom, claiming it was an act of mercy to save them from harsher fates, and then using them for his personal gratification before selling them to plantations in the Deep South, where conditions were even worse than in Louisiana. The woman who told Delphine this story had herself been one of his victims, and she described the judge's cruelty with a flat effect that suggested she had pushed the memories as far from her conscious mind as possible just to survive them. Mr. Cornelius Drake was a slave trader who operated out of Bellefonte, maintaining a yard where human beings were kept in pens like livestock while waiting to be sold. Delphine had never been to the yard herself, but she had heard descriptions from people who had passed through it. Tales of men and women chained together in the heat with inadequate water, children crying for parents who had already been sold, sick people left to die without medical care because treating them would have cost more than their sale price. Drake was known for his ability to separate families efficiently, for his skill at breaking the spirit of people who showed defiance, for his complete indifference to the suffering he caused. He dined at Whitmore Manor regularly because Colonel Whitmore did business with him, purchasing enslaved workers when needed, and occasionally selling those who were too old or sick to be productive. Captain Vincent Shaw had earned his title through military service during various conflicts with indigenous peoples and Mexico, and he wore it with pride despite having left active duty a decade earlier. He now operated as a merchant dealing in cotton, sugar, and occasionally in capturing people who had escaped from slavery and returning them to their owners for reward money. He was known for the violence of his methods, for using dogs to track escaped slaves through the swamps, for the condition in which he returned his captives. There were stories of people who had been caught by Shaw and brought back so brutalized that they never fully recovered, bodies broken as a message to others who might consider running. He spoke casually about this work over dinner, describing it as pest control, comparing human beings to vermin that needed to be eliminated, and the white men around the table would laugh at his stories while Delphine stood in the doorway waiting to clear plates. Mr. Leopold Grant owned the plantation adjacent to Whitmore Manor, a property slightly smaller but run with even harsher discipline. He was known for working enslaved people literally to death during harvest season, calculating that it was more profitable to extract maximum labor for a few years and then purchase new workers than to maintain a workforce at sustainable levels. Delphine had treated people who had escaped from Grant's plantation, hiding them in the root cellar beneath the kitchen while their wounds healed enough for them to travel further north. She had seen backs flayed open by whips, hands crushed in machinery that Grant refused to repair because repairs cost money, evidence of malnutrition so severe that people's bodies had begun to consume themselves. Grant came to Whitmore Manor frequently to discuss crop prices and labor costs, and he spoke about enslaved people the way others might discuss farm equipment, calculating depreciation and replacement costs with cold precision. Dr. Silas Morton presented perhaps the most disturbing case because his cruelty was cloaked in the authority of medicine. He was the physician most commonly called to treat enslaved people when their owners decided the expense was justified, and his methods were experimental in ways that ignored the humanity of his patients. Delphine had heard accounts of him testing new surgical techniques on enslaved people without their consent, performing operations without anesthesia because he claimed that the Negro constitution was less sensitive to pain than white people, a belief that was common among physicians of his era, but no less monstrous for its prevalence. He had purchased several enslaved women specifically for his experiments, keeping them in a building behind his house where he conducted procedures that would have been considered torture if performed on white patients. Some of these women had died from his experiments, and those who survived carried physical and psychological scars that would never fully heal. These 5 men represented different facets of the system that held Delphine and everyone she loved in bondage: the judge who used law as a weapon, the trader who profited from human misery, the hunter who turned people into prey, the owner who calculated human lives in dollars and cents, the doctor who hid sadism behind scientific inquiry. Each of them was respected in Bellefonte society, invited to the finest homes, greeted with deference on the street. Each of them considered himself a good Christian man, attended church regularly, and would have been genuinely offended if anyone suggested there was anything immoral about their actions. And each of them would die after dining at Whitmore Manor, their deaths separated by enough time and appearing natural enough that no one would connect them to the elaborate meals they had enjoyed months or years apart. Delphine's method for preparing the poison that would kill them was almost ritualistic in its precision. She would venture into the swamps near the Pearl River in the early morning when the mist still hung low over the water and the air was cool enough to make the walk bearable. The oleander grew in dense thickets in areas where the ground was soft and wet, its pink and white flowers blooming in clusters that seemed almost innocent in their beauty. She would wear gloves made from old rags when harvesting the flowers and leaves, knowing that even handling the plant could cause skin irritation. She would take only what she needed, never stripping a plant bare, leaving no obvious evidence of her harvesting. Back in the kitchen she would work late at night after everyone else had gone to sleep, using the dying embers of the fire to provide just enough heat for the extraction process. She would steep the oleander in alcohol, a small amount stolen over time from the manor's wine cellar, creating a tincture that concentrated the cardiac glycosides into a form that could be measured more precisely. The process took weeks, requiring multiple filtrations and careful testing on small animals to determine potency. She kept detailed notes in her hidden journal, recording the ratio of plant material to alcohol, the steeping time, the effects observed in her test subjects. She approached this work with the same dedication she brought to perfecting a sauce or mastering a new baking technique, understanding that precision was everything, that the difference between success and failure was measured in drops and minutes. The dosage required careful calculation based on each victim's size and general health. Too much would cause obvious poisoning, vomiting and convulsions that would prompt immediate medical attention and possible discovery. Too little would have no effect at all, wasting months of planning. The correct amount, distributed throughout multiple courses but concentrated primarily in the final dessert, would be absorbed slowly enough that symptoms would not appear until days later, when the victim was far from Whitmore Manor, and the connection to a dinner party would seem absurd. The black molasses cake served as the perfect delivery mechanism. The dark molasses and chocolate flavors were strong enough to mask any bitterness from the oleander extract. The dense texture of the cake ensured even distribution of the poison throughout each slice, and the fact that it was served only on special occasions when the most important guests were present, meant that Delphine could target specific individuals without arousing suspicion about why certain people received the cake and others did not. She would prepare multiple cakes, ensuring that the poisoned portion was served specifically to her intended victim while others at the table received identical-looking but harmless versions. The sleight of hand required to execute this substitution in a busy dining room with servants moving constantly and multiple courses being served was considerable, but Delphine had years to perfect the technique. Isaiah was the only person who knew what Delphine was doing, though she had never spoken about it explicitly. He had observed her late-night work in the kitchen, noticed the hidden journal, seen the particular care she took with certain preparations. He was smart enough to understand what the patterns meant, and he had made the choice not to ask questions that would force his aunt to either lie to him or burden him with knowledge that could get them both killed. Instead, he simply made sure to be available when she needed assistance, to cover for her absences when she went to harvest plants, to create distractions if anyone seemed about to discover her hiding places. Their shared understanding existed in the space between words, a conspiracy of silence that bound them together in ways that went beyond family. Esther suspected something but had deliberately chosen ignorance. She had seen too much suffering, endured too much trauma, to allow herself hope that anything could change. The idea that resistance was possible, that their oppressors could be harmed, was too dangerous for her to contemplate. So she worked in the main house, cleaned the silver and polished the furniture, and pretended not to notice the small rebellions happening in the kitchen building behind the manor. It was perhaps a mercy that she did not know the full extent of what Delphine was planning, because the knowledge would have terrified her in ways that might have made continuing to function impossible. The dinner party where Judge Horace Blackwell would consume his last meal took place on a warm evening in October 1847. The invitation had gone out weeks in advance, and the guest list included 8 of the most prominent men in Crescent County along with their wives. The occasion was ostensibly to celebrate the completion of a new wing on the manor house, but the real purpose was for Colonel Whitmore to solidify business relationships and political alliances that would benefit his interests in the coming year. The preparations took days, with every surface in the house scrubbed and polished, every piece of silver cleaned until it gleamed, every garden path raked smooth. Delphine had been planning the menu for months, designing a progression of dishes that would showcase her skills while building toward the final course where justice would be served alongside dessert. She had sourced the finest ingredients, negotiating with suppliers in New Orleans for items that could not be obtained locally. The kitchen became a center of controlled chaos in the days before the party, with multiple dishes being prepared simultaneously, each requiring precise timing to be ready at the exact moment it would be needed. The evening of October 17, 1847 arrived with the kind of weather that made Louisiana seem almost tolerable, the oppressive summer heat finally broken by cooler air that swept in from the north. The sun set in brilliant shades of orange and purple over the Pearl River, and a light breeze carried the scent of magnolias through the open windows of Whitmore Manor. Inside the dining room, candles had been lit in all 3 chandeliers, Their flames multiplied in the mirrors that lined the walls, creating an atmosphere of warmth and elegance that concealed the darkness at the heart of the gathering. Judge Horace Blackwell arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, his carriage pulling up to the front entrance with the kind of punctuality that suggested a man who valued control and order in all things. He was a large man, not fat but solid, with a broad chest and thick arms that spoke of physical strength despite his age. His face was jowly, with small eyes set deep beneath heavy brows, and his mouth had a cruel set to it even when he smiled. He wore his judicial authority like a second skin, carrying himself with the absolute confidence of someone who had spent decades making pronouncements that others were forced to accept as law. His wife had died 5 years earlier, and he had not remarried, which suited his purposes perfectly as it allowed him to maintain his household without the complications that a spouse might introduce. Colonel Whitmore greeted the judge with the elaborate courtesy that Southern men of their class used with each other, a performance of mutual respect that barely concealed the calculations each was making about how the other might be useful. They retired to the library for cognac while the other guests arrived, discussing politics and cotton prices and the growing tensions between northern and southern states over the question of slavery's expansion into new territories. Both men were adamantly pro-slavery, not just as an economic system but as what they considered the natural order of things, a hierarchy ordained by God, and validated by what they believed to be scientific evidence of racial differences. The other guests arrived in intervals over the next half hour. Mr. Leopold Grant came with his wife Constance, a thin nervous woman who rarely spoke and seemed perpetually startled by sudden noises. Captain Vincent Shaw arrived alone, having never married, a fact that local gossips attributed to his devotion to his work though others whispered darker explanations. Silas Morton brought his much younger wife Adelaide, whom he had married just 6 months earlier after his first wife succumbed to consumption. The remaining guests were plantation owners and their spouses, people whose names would not become important to this story, but who helped fill out the table and provided the social context that made the evening seem like any other elegant gathering, rather than an execution chamber. Delphine stood in the kitchen doorway watching the arrivals through the window, her face expressionless as she observed each guest descending from their carriages. She had changed into her best dress for the evening, a plain but clean garment of dark blue cotton that Cordelia Whitmore had given her the previous year, a cast-off that had been altered to fit. Her hair was wrapped in a clean cloth, and her hands had been scrubbed until they were raw. She looked exactly like what the white guests expected to see, a well-trained servant grateful for the opportunity to demonstrate her skills, when in reality she was a woman who had spent months preparing to commit murder, and was now hours away from executing her plan. Isaiah worked beside her in the kitchen, his movements efficient and practiced as he helped with the final preparations. He had said nothing about the significance of this particular dinner party, had asked no questions about why his aunt seemed more focused than usual, more precise in her measurements and timing, but she could see in his eyes that he understood something important was happening, that tonight was different from all the other elaborate meals they had prepared together. He was 17 now, nearly a man, and the weight of the knowledge he carried showed in the set of his shoulders, and the careful way he moved through the space. The first course was oysters brought up from the Gulf that morning, each one carefully shucked and arranged on beds of crushed ice with lemon wedges, and a mignonette sauce that Delphine had prepared using champagne vinegar, shallots and cracked black pepper. The oysters were served on the manor's finest china, each plate arranged to look like a small work of art. The guests ate them with appreciation, remarking on their freshness and the perfect balance of the sauce. Judge Blackwell consumed 6 of them, tilting each shell to his lips, and swallowing the oyster whole before squeezing lemon over the next one. His appetite was legendary, and watching him eat was slightly obscene in its enthusiasm, a physical pleasure that seemed almost violent in its intensity. Between courses there were carefully timed intervals that allowed for conversation and digestion. The men dominated the discussion while their wives offered occasional comments that were always deferential, always supportive of whatever point their husbands were making. They talked about the upcoming elections, about concerns over slave rebellions inspired by news from other states, about the proper way to manage agricultural workers to maximize productivity. Judge Blackwell held forth on several cases he had recently decided, describing with satisfaction how he had sentenced an enslaved man to 50 lashes for the crime of learning to read, a punishment he considered lenient given that the law allowed for much worse. Delphine stood near the kitchen doorway throughout the meal, directing the service with small gestures and quiet words to the house servants who carried dishes back and forth. She could hear every word spoken in the dining room, could see the faces of the guests as they laughed at stories of human suffering, as they congratulated each other on their wisdom and virtue. The rage that lived in her chest burned steady and cold, a fire that had been carefully banked and now provided not heat but light, illuminating the path she had chosen with absolute clarity. There was no doubt in her mind about what she was doing, no moral uncertainty about whether these men deserved their fate. They had built their wealth and power on the backs of enslaved people, had caused suffering that could never be adequately measured or revenged, and the law that should have held them accountable was instead their tool and weapon. The turtle soup came next, a rich brown liquid with chunks of meat and vegetables, seasoned with sherry and herbs that filled the dining room with their aroma. This course required the most skill to prepare correctly, the broth needing to be simmered for hours to extract all the flavors from the turtle meat while remaining clear rather than cloudy. Delphine had learned the technique from Celestine, who had learned it from another cook whose name was now lost to time, a chain of knowledge passed down through generations of enslaved women who had mastered the cuisine of their oppressors better than the oppressors themselves ever could. Judge Blackwell praised the soup effusively, calling for Delphine to be brought to the dining room so he could compliment her directly. She came when summoned, standing just inside the doorway with her eyes lowered in the posture of humility that was expected. The judge told her that it was the finest turtle soup he had ever tasted, that she was a credit to the Whitmore household, that Colonel Whitmore was fortunate to own such a skilled cook. The words were meant as praise, but they carried the casual dehumanization that permeated every interaction between enslaved people and their owners. She was being complimented the way one might praise a horse for running fast or a dog for being well trained, recognition of useful ability that reinforced rather than challenged her status as property. Delphine curtsied and thanked the judge in a soft voice, playing the role that had kept her alive and relatively safe for 34 years, but behind her lowered eyes, she was calculating, making mental notes about how much the judge had eaten, how much wine he had consumed, how his body would process what was to come. She had studied him for months, learning his habits and appetites, and she knew that he typically ate large quantities and drank heavily, both factors that would affect the way the poison she had prepared would work in his system. The fish course featured red snapper that had been caught that morning in the Gulf, the flesh white and flaky, prepared simply with butter and herbs to let the natural flavor shine through. It was accompanied by new potatoes roasted with rosemary and green beans that had been grown in the manor's garden. The simplicity of the preparation belied the skill required to execute it perfectly, to cook the fish just until it was done, but not a moment longer, to time everything so that each element of the dish reached the table at its ideal temperature. As the guests ate, the conversation turned to the question of what should be done about abolitionists, those Northerners who insisted that slavery was immoral and should be ended. The men at the table spoke of abolitionists with a venom that suggested genuine fear beneath their contempt. They recognized, perhaps more clearly than they would admit, that their entire way of life depended on a system that was morally indefensible, and could only be maintained through violence and legal coercion. The possibility that this system might be challenged, that they might lose their wealth and status, filled them with a rage that they directed at those who questioned slavery's legitimacy rather than at the institution itself. Captain Shaw told a story about capturing a group of escaped slaves who had been helped by abolitionists operating in Louisiana, describing in detail how he had tracked them through the swamps using dogs and how he had returned them to their owner, along with information about the people who had assisted them. The abolitionists had been arrested and prosecuted, receiving jail sentences that Shaw clearly felt were too lenient. He believed they should have been hanged as an example to others who might consider helping enslaved people escape. The other men at the table nodded their agreement, and Judge Blackwell mentioned that he would have imposed the death penalty if the case had come before his court. Delphine listened to these stories while she prepared the main course, her hands steady as she carved the roasted duck that would serve as the centerpiece of the meal. The bird had been cooking for hours, its skin now crisp and golden, the meat tender enough to fall from the bone. She arranged slices on serving platters with a cherry sauce she had made using fruit preserves, brandy and spices, creating a presentation that was visually stunning, and would taste even better than it looked. This was the course where her reputation as a cook was most on display, where any error would be immediately apparent to guests who considered themselves connoisseurs of fine dining. The duck was served with wild rice and roasted root vegetables, and the combination of flavors was exactly what Delphine had intended, each element complementing the others to create something greater than the sum of its parts. Judge Blackwell ate 3 portions, using bread to soak up every drop of the cherry sauce, clearly enjoying himself immensely. The wine flowed freely, bottles of French red that Colonel Whitmore had been saving for a special occasion, and the atmosphere in the dining room grew more relaxed as the alcohol loosened tongues and lowered inhibitions. It was during this course that Mr. Leopold Grant began telling stories about managing enslaved workers on his plantation, describing the punishments he imposed for various infractions with the same tone another man might use to discuss training dogs or breaking horses. He spoke about a man who had been caught stealing food and had been whipped until he could no longer stand, about a woman who had talked back to an overseer, and had been locked in a box under the summer sun for 2 days, about children who were separated from their parents as punishment for their parents' perceived laziness. The other guests listened with interest, some offering their own stories of discipline and punishment, treating human suffering as a topic for casual dinner conversation. Delphine could see Isaiah's hands trembling as he helped her prepare the next course, could see the rage and pain in his eyes as he listened to these stories. She touched his arm briefly, a small gesture of connection and warning, reminding him without words that they had to maintain their composure, that any reaction would put them in danger. He took a deep breath and continued working, channeling his emotions into the precise movements required by the tasks at hand. The cheese course provided a brief intermission between the heavy main dishes and the dessert that was to come. Delphine had selected 3 types of cheese from supplies that had arrived from New Orleans the previous week, arranging them on a board with grapes, figs, and thin slices of bread that had been toasted until they were crisp. The guests ate less of this course, their appetites beginning to flag after the substantial portions they had already consumed, but they picked at the cheese while continuing their conversations. The talk had turned to politics again, specifically to the question of whether Louisiana should support the expansion of slavery into territories acquired from Mexico. Judge Blackwell was emphatic in his belief that slavery should be extended to every new territory and state, that the economic and social benefits of the system were so obvious that only fools or fanatics could oppose it. He spoke of enslaved people as if they were no more than beasts of burden, their labor to be exploited and their suffering irrelevant to any moral calculations. His words revealed a worldview so completely devoid of empathy that it was almost difficult to comprehend, a moral blindness so profound that it seemed almost like a form of insanity. Silas Morton contributed his own perspective, offering what he presented as scientific evidence for the inferiority of African peoples, citing measurements of skull sizes and theories about racial hierarchies that were common among physicians and intellectuals of the era. His calm, rational tone made his arguments seem reasonable to the other guests, who nodded along as if he were explaining simple facts about the natural world rather than constructing elaborate justifications for treating human beings as property. This was perhaps the most insidious aspect of the slavery system, the way it had convinced intelligent, educated people that their participation in monstrous evil was actually virtuous, actually ordained by God and validated by science. In the kitchen, Delphine was putting the finishing touches on the black molasses cake that would serve as the final course. She had baked 3 cakes that afternoon, identical in appearance but very different in content. 2 of them were completely safe, prepared with her usual recipe, and nothing more. The third contained the oleander extract she had been preparing for months, carefully measured and mixed into the batter in quantities that would be absorbed throughout the cake, but concentrated most heavily in the center slices. She had marked the poisoned cake with a small notch on one side of the pan, invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking for it, but unmistakable to her experienced eyes. The cakes had been frosted with dark chocolate that held its shape perfectly despite the warmth of the evening. She cut each cake into 8 slices, arranging them on serving plates with a small dollop of whipped cream on the side. The poisoned slices went onto specific plates that she marked with a tiny fingerprint on the rim, barely visible but enough to ensure that Isaiah would know which plate to place in front of Judge Blackwell when the dessert was served. As she worked, Delphine felt a strange calm settle over her. This was the moment she had been planning for so long, the culmination of months of preparation and years of rage transformed into action. She felt no fear, no doubt, no last-minute uncertainty about whether she should proceed. The path ahead was clear, and she walked it with the confidence of someone who knows exactly what they are doing and why. This was not murder in her mind but justice, a balancing of scales that the law would never balance, a form of resistance that was the only one available to her. Isaiah carried the plates into the dining room on a silver tray, placing each one in front of the appropriate guest with the careful precision that Delphine had drilled into him. The marked plate went to Judge Blackwell, who looked at the cake with evident pleasure, already reaching for his fork before Isaiah had finished serving the other guests. The judge took his first bite and closed his eyes in appreciation, savoring the complex flavors of molasses and chocolate and spice. He ate slowly for once, actually tasting what he was consuming, rather than simply shoveling food into his mouth, and Delphine watched from the doorway as he consumed every bite of the poisoned slice. The other guests also praised the cake, declaring it the best dessert they had ever eaten, asking Delphine once again for the recipe that she would never share. Colonel Whitmore beamed with pride, pleased that his cook had once again demonstrated her superiority over anyone else in the county. Cordelia Whitmore allowed herself a small smile, satisfied that the dinner party had been a social success. None of them had any idea that they had just witnessed a murder, that the generous portions of cake and the warm atmosphere of hospitality had concealed an act of calculated revenge. After dessert, the guests retired to the parlor for coffee and cordials, the men separating from the women to smoke cigars and continue their political discussions. Judge Blackwell complained of feeling overly full, which was hardly surprising given the quantity of food he had consumed, but he showed no signs of immediate distress. The oleander extract worked slowly, would not produce symptoms for at least 2 days, giving him time to return to his own home, and making any connection to the dinner party seem impossible. The evening finally ended near midnight, with carriages being brought around and guests departing with effusive thanks to their hosts. Judge Blackwell's carriage was one of the last to leave, the judge himself moving somewhat slowly as he climbed inside, but everyone attributed this to the heavy meal and substantial quantities of wine he had consumed. He called out a final compliment to Delphine as he departed, telling Colonel Whitmore once again how fortunate he was to own such a talented cook. The irony of those words, the casual assertion of ownership over the woman who had just killed him, was not lost on Delphine as she watched his carriage disappear down the Oakline Drive. In the kitchen, as she and Isaiah cleaned up the remnants of the dinner party, Delphine felt something she had not experienced in years. It was not quite happiness but something adjacent to it, a sense of satisfaction and completion, of having accomplished something important even though no one would ever know what she had done. She had struck a blow against the system that held her in bondage, had removed one instrument of oppression from the world, had demonstrated that even the most powerless could exercise a form of power that their oppressors would never see coming. Isaiah worked beside her in silence, understanding without being told that what had happened tonight must never be spoken of directly, must never be acknowledged in words that could be overheard or repeated. They scrubbed pots and wiped down surfaces, and put away the special china, moving through familiar tasks while the magnitude of what they had done settled over them like morning mist over the river. 3 days later, news reached Whitmore Manor that Judge Horace Blackwell had died in his sleep. A servant had found him in his bed, his face peaceful, no signs of struggle or distress. Dr. Morton was called to examine the body and pronounced the cause of death to be heart failure, a common enough occurrence in a man of the judge's age and size. There was no autopsy, no investigation, no suggestion that anything unnatural had occurred. The judge was buried with full honors, his funeral attended by everyone of importance in Crescent County, and his death was mourned as the loss of a pillar of the community. Colonel Whitmore attended the funeral and returned to the manor with the news, mentioning to his family over dinner that it was a shame to lose such a distinguished man, that the judge would be difficult to replace. Delphine served the meal that evening with the same quiet efficiency she always demonstrated, her face revealing nothing of the satisfaction that burned in her chest like a banked fire. She had killed a man who had used the law as a weapon against enslaved people, who had purchased women for his personal gratification, and then sold them into even worse situations, who had caused suffering that could never be adequately quantified, and she had done it in a way that would never be detected, never be punished, never even be suspected. The success of this first killing validated everything Delphine had planned and prepared. She knew now that her method worked, that the dosage was correct, that the timing allowed enough distance between the dinner party and the death to prevent any connection being made. She knew that she could do this again, that the other names on her list could be addressed one by one over the months and years to come. The work would require patience and care, would demand that she maintain her mask of docility, while she systematically eliminated men who used their power to cause suffering. But Delphine had patience in abundance, had been forced to cultivate it throughout her entire life, and she knew how to wait for the right moment. She had years ahead of her, assuming she was not sold or killed by her owners, and she would use that time to pursue the only form of justice available to someone in her position. The kitchen that had been her prison would become her weapon, and the skills that made her valuable to her oppressors would become the means of their destruction. In the weeks following Judge Blackwell's death, life at Whitmore Manor returned to its normal rhythms. The fall harvest demanded everyone's attention, and the plantation operated with the brutal efficiency that characterized the slavery system at its height. Delphine continued cooking 3 meals a day for the Whitmore family, continued maintaining her reputation as the finest cook in the county, continued playing the role of grateful servant while she planned the next phase of her long campaign. She had learned something important from Judge Blackwell's death, which was that patience and careful planning were more effective than any impulsive action could be. She would not rush through her list, would not kill multiple victims in quick succession and risk establishing a pattern that might eventually be noticed. Instead, she would space the deaths out over years, would vary her methods slightly each time, would ensure that each killing appeared to be the result of natural causes or tragic accident rather than deliberate murder. The next name on her list was Mr. Cornelius Drake, the slave trader who operated out of Bellefonte. But Delphine knew that she needed to wait, to let enough time pass that no one would think to connect his eventual death to Judge Blackwell's, to rebuild her supplies of oleander extract and possibly develop additional methods of administering poison that would make detection even less likely. She had all the time in the world, or at least as much time as an enslaved woman could ever have, and she would use it wisely. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.